it's pretty crammed. I'm going to go through at a rate of knots, so please forgive it. Sacred geography, we'll look at some different types of sacred geography. And what is sacred geography? Good question. What sacred geography is, it's the meeting of physical landscape, topography, and the human mind and spirit and soul, whatever you want, geographies of the soul, if you like. And it's a meeting of those two elements. And as I shall say at the end, with a dramatic picture, that we, what ancient peoples did, they invested their landscape with meaning. And generally as a culture, we don't do that now. And I'll come back to that. Magical mindscapes, sacred geography, however you want to describe it. Most sacred geographies, plural, are either visual or auditory or a bit of both, but they can use other sensory things, and I'll just mention this in passing. For example, on this Sawieki in one of the Fijian islands, there's a sacred place, it's a beach, and the sand smells like vanilla. And because of that scent, natural scent there, it became imbued with meaning, with spiritual significance. So there can be many things that will trigger a sacred geography. But I thought we'd look at about 7 or 8 different types of sacred geography. The first being what I call the topography of myth, venerated natural places, because the first sacred geography, if you like, was the unadulterated land itself. And people living in different landscapes would gravitate towards particular features in the landscape, which they would imbue with the sacred, where they would go and get a sense of the numinous. And these were the first sacred places. Levi Brule said of the Australian or Australasian Aborigine, "The land is a living book in which the myths are inscribed. A legend is captured in the very outlines of the landscape." And as I say, I was saying that about Australasian Aboriginal peoples, but he could have said it about any Aboriginal peoples anywhere in the world. Their myths, they lived amongst their mythic imagery. Okay, what sort of sites would acquire this numinous power, or have a numinous power that attracted people? Well, we'll start right where we are. Always a good idea. Landmarks, various types of landmarks, things that stuck out in the landscape, would naturally attract the attention of people living in those landscapes. And we know here at Glastonbury, I mean, the Tor is quite a distinctive landmark, and it becomes the focus for myth and legends. And we all know that sort of soft luminosity that occurs here. And it has a magical, the Isle of Avalon and all the rest of it. I'll tell you an interesting legend is associated. I mean, it was the last, supposedly the last place for the king of the fairies. It was the entrance to Annwn, the Celtic underworld or otherworld. But it's an interesting feature you may or may not know about, but you know Cadbury Castle is about 12 miles away, believed to be the site of the actual historical Camelot. But on there's a legend, it certainly goes back to the 15th century, and possibly much, much older. Geoffrey Ash said it's much older. That says that King Arthur will ride out of Cadbury Castle and lead the wild host. And you know the legend of the wild host. It's all over Europe in medieval and early medieval and even earlier times. The idea of a furious host of spirits led by some charismatic, a god, a hero figure, a goddess, whatever. And they would whoosh through the landscape, picking up anybody that was very ill or on their deathbeds or whatever, and take the souls with them. And indeed, this was greatly feared in medieval times. And there are actual instructions of how not to be taken by the wild host. And in case you need to know, and ever in that position, you lie on your back and you cross your arms like that, like some Egyptian pharaoh. And they might pass over with a bit of luck. Close your eyes, by the way. So it shoots over you. And what they did here, between Cadbury Castle, they went to the Tor to deliver the souls they picked up to the mouth of Annan. So they delivered to the underworld. And King Arthur was at the head. So it's at least half a millennium old, that legend, and maybe much older. Now, what's interesting, archaeological digs on Cadbury Castle have revealed, the remains of what might have been the old Camelot, a great fortified structure and citadel. But in the last few years, they excavated a burial site of early Bronze Age, much older, sort of 2000 BC, 1800 BC. And it was the burial of a large male, had his bones there, and he was buried in a ritual boat. And it was on the side of Cadbury Castle that faces the Tor, which is perfectly visible on the skyline. So it's a landmark. And the prow of this boat, the pointy end, pointed to the Tor. So it looked like, and if you remember the legends, the romances, the Arthurian romances, that the dying Arthur is put in a fairy bark and taken to the land of immortal souls. And one can only wonder if that early Bronze Age burial of this very tall fellow was really where that element of the Arthurian romances began. Long, long ago, thousands of years ago. It's known that there's Iron Age mythology encoded in the Arthurian romance, but my guess is it goes back further. But anyway, so the wild host runs down there. You've got this curious archaeological linkage pointing to the Tor. And in fragments along the way of the wild host, there are actual old trackways, sections of trackways, that mark out exactly the same course. So we get a sense that there's a multi-layered mythological patina over this landscape that relates to this particular landmark. And then we know what the Christians did. There they are. So it's natural places, venerated places, attracted the attention of early peoples, and through the ages, mythological filters built over them. Another type of natural sacred place, of course, were sacred peaks. This is just an excuse to show this painting by Nicholas Roerich. Beautiful, it always fascinates me. What do we have? Sacred peaks. Oh, Mount Shasta, California, Northern California. It's a sacred peak to the Wintu Indians who live in the territory. And their tradition is that when you die, your soul travels to the peak of Mount Shasta and then off to heaven. And there's a secret geography around here. There are little rocks set up perching on the edges of cliffs and so on. They are markers, and they're markers for the soul of dead people, so they can find them and find their way. Similar ideas in Oceania. Kiribati has places where the soul goes in a straight line to the place of dread, and that's a marked route through the landscape. Other examples of sacred peaks, Mount Siluritis, the old Mount Ida in Crete, the temple palace of Phaistos, the lines to it, and there's a whole thing about cleft or saddle peaks in Crete, or in Greece generally. And these are significant features. You see there's a sort of black hole there. That's the sacred cave of Comares. So you've got a double significance here. If you go on to mainland Greece, those Greeks picked up stuff from the Minoans who occupied Crete, and they built stuff underneath cleft peaks. So, for example, this is the temple of Eleusis, and it's overlooked by Mount Carata, which is a very significant, powerful cleft peak. And Eleusis, of course, was the mystery temple of ancient Greece, where they probably drank ergotized beer, natural LSD, and went through great rituals, and Plato and Pythagoras, all of them went through this. And it was said that those who went through this initiation never feared death afterwards. Back on Crete, if we take the site of Knossos, the temple palace, that's overlooked by Mount Juctus. There's also a cleft peak. And if you go up there, Charlotte and I did one day and got beaten back by Zeus, with thunderbolts coming down on all sides, but we went up again. This time he let us get up there. And you get to that top, the peak, there's a rock, big summit rock, and there's a fissure, another one of these fissures again, one of these cracks. And long before the Minoans came in the Bronze Age, the Neolithic inhabitants of Crete were throwing votive objects into that crack. So there's already mountain worship going on, but when the Minoans got there, they put an altar up on this one, and they slightly walled in, they keyed in walling into the natural rock there, and made a summit shrine. And there are 22 such peaks on the island of Crete. What is interesting, Vincent Scully, the American art historian, suggested many years ago, he reckoned that the horns of consecration, this symbol that occurs time and again in archaeological studies of the Minoans, he thinks that was probably inspired by the horned or cleft peak mountains, in which case it means that the landscape actually contributed to Minoan iconography, another way the land can speak. I thought I'd show you this one. The Inca were also great mountain worshippers, and as you doubtless know, that they found mummified bodies of children at 20,000 feet or whatever of some of the mountain peaks, and some of them had been allowed to die of cold, heavily sedated with coca, or they'd been hit over the back of the head, more bluntly, and offerings laid. So there were sacrifices to the mountains. But less well known is that in the Andes, the various groups of the Inca would deform their heads. But their heads were deformed, so they took on the shape, the outline of their particular sacred peak. So it might be pointy, it might be flat-topped, or it could be rounded, as you see there. So they actually carried the image of the mountain around in the shape of their skulls. Not a lot of people know that. Okay, so mountain peaks, obviously. Water places also became sacred to many peoples around the world, of course. Waterfalls, springs, rivers, bends in rivers sometimes became sacred. And the ancient Celts considered waterfalls, springs and wells to be entrances to Anan, the underworld. Celtic seers would wrap themselves in animal skins and sleep next to the waterfalls in order to have prophetic dreams. And if you ever slept next to a waterfall, you know you can hear sounds like voices calling and so on. It's a fabulous pink or white noise background into which all sorts of things can be heard. And you do have interesting dreams. Another thing about water, again quite close to here, of course, is Bath in England. A pagan site, became a Roman holy site, and it also then became a spa in Regency times. The water comes from, this is a Roman aqueduct underneath the thing here, and the water comes out from the Mendips. That water is radioactive. We'd heard that people had said it was, and we actually conducted measurements there a good many years ago on the Dragon project, and it is radioactive water. Not radioactive in 3 Mile Island sense, of course, but, 5 times background, 6 times background. And I've often wondered if there's a sort of homeopathic dose of radiation that could have healing effects. But I'm not recommending it. I don't want to be sued. Anyway, very early on, of course, and we all know this, caves came to be considered as sacred places. And we know that they left their paintings, and we talked this morning a bit about the acoustics in there. And you only have to think of the sound in caves and the darkness, sensory deprivation, sound, mysterious noises, and the idea of them becoming ritual places. They were the first cathedrals. There's both a cave and a water place here, the Balancanche cave and the Yucatan, not far from Chichen Itza. And that's water, it's an underground lagoon. And the Mayans went down there to collect what they call virgin water, pure water that had never seen daylight, had not come running out and running all over the place. Excuse me. So they collected this. They also, in the same cave actually, you go past stalactites under which there are stone bowls and so on that collected the drops of water dripping off. And this was virgin water as well. All sorts of votive offerings thrown in there as well. And I'll show you something else from that cave in a few minutes. What I will tell you is that either there's not much oxygen, well, there's not much oxygen down there, and I'm not sure that the rocks aren't giving off something, but anyway, if you're down there for about 15, 20 minutes, you suddenly find yourself not breathing air anymore, and it can get quite scary. And I thought I was going to die, but we got out. But it's very strange, and I wonder if that was also an element in sort of altered states and so on. Yeah, another type of site was trees. We know the Minoans had sacred trees. And we know from the Seahenge case where the tide uncovered this timber ring with a tree bowl inverted, put down in the middle. So we know trees and so on were worshipped, but of course they're organic and by and large they don't last over thousands of years. And there's been discussion that the stones of Stonehenge, some of them have, they've got mortise and tenon joints for the lintels, but some of them have tongue and groove as well. And so they were treated like timber, and we know there were loads of timber circles around. They found the post holes of them. So trees, timber, and so on also were natural sacred places. A memory of the sacred tree of the maypoles or maybaums. This is a maybaum in Berkshire in Germany. This is a maypole in Padstow. And this is a memory of the sacred tree. Then what happened in different times, in different places, that these natural venerated places began to become slightly embellished. So there might be rock art carved on part of a rock face or the bottom of a mountain, or objects would be made from the rocks of these places, the soil or whatever, or very low retaining walls. If you go to see the tours on Bodmin Moor, for example, you look very carefully, you can see very subtle retaining walls around some of them. They were a natural sacred place as well. And so it goes. Okay, the second type of sacred geography involves what I call places with faces. And these are simulacra. Things that look like something like face, a poodle in a cloud, or a face in the bark of a tree or whatever. An accidental simulacrum. Looks like something else without apparently intelligent design. So, for example, the Paps of Anu, Paps, ancient word for breasts, and the goddess Anu, this is near Killarney in Ireland, where they used to, I think still do actually, dance at Lunasa. And this was the goddess in the landscape. Other examples? I'm just giving you a handful of very few examples, you understand that. This is Buffalo Rock in Manitoba, and still worshipped by the Indians, because those who took me through here actually made offerings of tobacco and whatever here. And it's like the hunched shape of a buffalo at rest, and they call it the Buffalo Rock. But actually it's on the way to a weird sacred landscape I'll show you shortly, another type of sacred geography. But it's a simulacrum. There's one a bit closer to home than Manitoba. Is the giant of Carn Bray. And you see it's a beautiful simulacrum. Cheekbones and nose and lips are beautiful, beautiful. And there's a legend associated with that, and another giant on top of another hill about 6 or 7 miles away. Germany, example, Externstein stones, these weird fingers of rock. There's a chapel up there, or a pagan temple, nobody's ever figured out which. A scary little bridge over from that to that. And it's a lot of fun. A lot of people throw themselves off there, a lot of suicides, so yeah, locked off now. Anyway, on the side here is this thing here. And it's a natural configuration, but it does, as you see, looks like a figure on a cross or something like that, tied to a tree, whatever. And there's debate whether it was taken, read as Christ on the cross, or Odin tied to the world tree, Yggdrasil, as he learned the secret of the runes for whatever it was, 9 days and nights. And it's got mythology, probably from different traditions. The reason we think it at least was Christianized, because there's what appears to be an artificial hole in its side, you know, like the spear mark on Christ. And so if that's true, then this is probably the only Christianized simulacrum, natural simulacrum I know of, but who the hell knows. Anyway, over to ancient Egypt. This is Hatshepsut's temple. Everybody remarks how modern and beautiful it is, and people have remarked how it's keyed into the bottom of this rock face here at Deir el Bahari, and in the Valley of the Kings. And people say that, where did the fabulous culture of ancient Egypt, of dynastic Egypt, come from? Like it just appeared. Well, it didn't just appear. If you have the eyes to see, you can see how it grew out of the landscape. And this is a case in point. Nobody saw this till 1992, and then it was Anthony Donahue who saw it. He realized there was a simulacrum here rising up behind the temple. And if you look carefully, you can see perhaps the outline of a pharaoh with the beard, and over the top a cobra with distended hood. And so there it is. Now, interestingly, across the river, over the Nile on the other side, in the Temple of Karnak, they found a figurine, so high, I think it was, which is just that. It shows a pharaoh with the cobra of dominion rearing over his head like that. And nobody'd seen it because it's very weathered. It's natural, but it may have been aided and abetted. Once Donahue had seen this, he went on and looked at other examples. So these are pre-dynastic temples here, where you can see this has obviously been worked on, but you see a sort of proto-sphinx. And this one here, underneath this rock, which seems to have a human profile, an old man, there's a temple, and it's dedicated to Min, that became the later Roman god Pan, the god of nature, spirit of nature. This may be artificial, but we don't know. Nobody's actually done a study of that. Anyway, Donahue's found about 7 or 8 temples that are linked to these simulacra along the Nile. So these things seem to emerge out of the pre-dynastic landscape. Not all simulacra are of human shape and form. This is back in the Balakanchi cave I mentioned a few moments ago. And the simulacrum here is this remarkable fused stalactite, stalagmite, calcite thing, and it looks, as you see, like a stone tree. And the Mayans had a tradition of a world tree. I can't pronounce the name, but anyway, they had it. And when archaeologists broke in through a rockfall here in 1959, everything had been left as it was 1,000 years before. And so you find these censers and bowls, offerings, and whatever were around there. And these particular ones have been left in situ. And you see it's blackened because they used to burn copal incense here, and the smoke blackened the thing. How the hell they did that, because as I say, there's not a lot of oxygen around there. So it wouldn't have burned for long, and it wouldn't have been a good idea to hang around while they were doing it. Okay, third type of sacred geography I call center place, mind, body, land. And it's the most difficult type to explain. If you go to, say, Delphi, various Greek temples, ancient Greek temples, you come across stones, most of them are not as elaborate as this. This one is one of the omphalos stones, or navel stones, at Delphi. And it's about, I don't know, 3 foot tall or whatever. And this thing, this net, nobody quite knows what it is. There's various theories. But anyway, the point is that these omphaloi mark the center of the world. And yet every other temple has got one. This idea of there being a center was prevalent throughout the ancient world. These are the Dogon, for example. And this is their image of the center of the world, the omphalos. It's an upturned granary basket. It's got an arrow sticking in it. It's oriented to the compass points and so on. And that's their image of a world center. We're familiar with this one, the Norse world tree, the great ash tree, Yggdrasil. And it has the 3 worlds, the sort of heaven world, the middle world, Middle Earth, where we hang out, and the roots that go down to the underworld, the world of the ancestors and the chthonic forces. If you go to, should you want to go to Siberia and see the shamans there, the classical shamans, some of them will have the world tree emblazoned on their ritual robes. And it's traditional there, they say that the rim of their drums, their shamanic drums, are fashioned from the branch of a tree that stands at the golden navel of the world. So again, this idea. Now, what the hell does this mean, and how can there be so many different world centers? Well, what the shamans did, they'd beat on their drum until they went into a trance. This bloke sparked out here, you see, and they put a drum on the back, which is a sign that he's travelling in spirit. This bloke is well on his way by the looks of his face, and either he's been at the vodka, I don't know which, but anyway, he's on his way. And they in spirit, they flew to the world tree. All this is metaphorical language to explain how they travelled between the worlds. So the shaman could travel up to the heaven world or down into the ancestral world, chthonic world, or fly out elsewhere in this world and perform various functions. Another type of certain mountains were selected by different peoples as a world center, a central thing. And for the Hindus and for the Buddhists, Mount Kailash became a world mountain. Much more complex than I'm saying. There's a whole bunch of stuff around this, but basically that's what it is. It was a world mountain. And this is often symbolized in the temple architecture. So here at Angkor Wat, for example, these things here represent the mountains of the corners of the world, but that center one is Mount Meru, both a mythical and a physical mountain in this case. Mount Meru is at the center of the world, and the pole star hangs above it. The pole star to the Tungus shamans was the nail star. It held the universe together, and they would, when they went into a trance, they might climb up the tent pole, the yurt, go out through the smoke hole and fly to the nail star. All these are images about an axis, a cosmic axis, a world centre. And I'm just trying to indicate that they come out in all sorts. Even in Ireland, the Stone of Divisions, which is on the hill of Ushna, pretty much fairly central in Ireland. It's got various other names. In Pueblo Indian tradition, they have their kivas, their ritual ceremonial chambers, semi-subterranean, and they have a little hole in it, not this thing, which is a half, but a little hole called a sipapu. And this is the point of emergence where the first people came out of the previous earth into this world. And that's what it symbolizes and represents, the sipapu. This is a Hopi Indian altar with the 4 cardinal directions. And interestingly, a direction here that's down and a direction here which is up, again representing the vertical axis. So you have the horizontal axis of the cardinal points, the compass points, and a vertical axis. This is the Beaver Indians of Canada, who have a similar sort of thing. The 3 worlds, just like in Yggdrasil, Middle Earth, Heaven World, Underworld, and the compass directions. So what's it all about, and how can there be a lot of centres of the world? Well, you have to think this really modelled on the human being standing in the landscape, and it's a transference into the topography of this basic sense of location. The 4 directions, front, back and sides, your north and south, your mouth. Above, sun at noon. Down below on this axis, the sun at midnight. And you have the image of the body, if you like, projected onto the land. And the reason you can have a lot of world centres, because each of you are in your world centre now. Every one of you has a circuit around you. And there's 6 billion world centres, or whatever the count is lately in the world. So that's the image that works about it. And the good thing to remember, because you're at the centre of the world, you're always here. Wherever you are, even if you're over there, just take the T off and here you are. So always remember that. I find it reassuring, even when I get lost, which is often. Okay, the next type of sacred geography is the geography of pilgrimage, walking through holy lands. Himalayan pilgrimage, there we are, back at Mount Kailash again. As I say, Buddhist, Hindu, and long before them, I suspect, a Bompo tradition, an earth religion tradition. And we know there's this big pilgrimage circuit around the world mountain. In the Stone Age, it's been suggested by Roy Loveday, an archaeologist, he's been looking at henges like this in parts of northern England that have double entrance. These are Neolithic features. They're ceremonial features. They're not fortifications. But they have 2 entrances. And he lined up some of the entrances of different ones, and he suddenly realized he was looking at a pilgrimage trail. And very interesting, much later Roman roads echo these routes. Like there was a route that was well known 2,000 years earlier, and the route is a very interesting thing, the way a road goes. The road itself might be quite recent. We've got one near our place. It's a Roman road. The actual Roman surface is 4 feet down beneath the present surface. So a route is an intangible thing. It's like an axis of a global, you have a globe, spinning. The axis doesn't actually exist. It's not tangible, yet it's really there. And routeways are a bit like this. So it's quite possible that these things were part of a whole pilgrimage tradition in the Neolithic. I think this particular one, hey, I just pulled the picture out. I think it's Thornborough, actually, one of the Thornborough henges. But there are many more of double entrance henges. Then you have Hindu faithscapes, another type of pilgrimage thing, and this one here, Braj, in India, is a Krishna landscape. What the pilgrims do, they walk around this very large area on a particular routes, and in some places, at certain times of the year, they actually have people performing underneath a tree or in a particular grove a scene from the life of Krishna. And so you actually visit, you follow the mythography of Krishna in the physical landscape, and the pilgrimage route represents that and will stop you at certain places and whatever. And certain places you shouldn't get to until certain times of day because you don't want to disturb the spirit of Krishna who's having a bit of nucky in one corner over there or is asleep somewhere else. And it's beautifully, it's orchestrated geography. And this, of course, familiar to us all, the bathing in the Ganges at Varanasi or Benares. But less well known is that I think it's like 52 circuits, pilgrimage circuits around. And some you do at certain times of the year and not others. And the Hindus, they call them faithscapes, which I think is a wonderful phrase. Christian pilgrimage, well, too many to mention really, but we'll go to an early one, Mount Sinai in Egypt. And again, this is an orchestrated journey through the landscape. So you stop at certain points where you can see the mountain or some significant feature, where you would stop and perhaps cut off your hair or whatever, make some offering. So it's highly orchestrated. And then one of the greatest Christian pilgrimages, of course, is that of Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. And people came from all over Europe to this, still do actually, from all over the world. And then there's a particularly organized route to the shrine. And again, there are stops on the way, the Field of Stars, various other things where legendary events were said to occur. So it's a mythologized landscape with an orchestrated route through it, which is the best way to describe pilgrimage, I guess. And then perhaps the most famous pilgrimage of all, the Hajj, the circuit of the Kaaba, which contains what is possibly and probably a meteoric stone, the tawaf, the circulation of that. But less well known to a lot of non-Muslims is that that's only a bit of the pilgrimage journey. There's a controlled movement through the landscape to outlying places, each of them having meaning in the life of Muhammad, and so on. And it takes a day or two to do the whole thing. Another image of the pilgrimage. I'll give a couple of examples of Native American pilgrimage because very little is known about those. This particular one is a human Indian pilgrimage circuit. Can I find it? It goes up the Colorado River Valley up here, sort of, and it actually goes up there. And it starts near a mountain called Pilot Knob, almost on the, here we are, almost on the Mexican border. And it follows up as you go along. And the end point in just the southern tip of Nevada is what's called Dead Mountain. Dead Mountain, that's not snow, that's bare rock. It's a bald mountain. And the Indians called it Avikwami, or Spirit Mountain. And shamans, rain shamans, would come from perhaps 400 miles away to this place. And ordinary Indians, as it were, would do their pilgrimage up to it periodically. And they didn't actually go to the top of the mountain. This was the point they came to. It's called Grapevine Canyon. And when you get inside the canyon, you find it absolutely loaded with rock art everywhere. Rock art. This symbol here, the bighorn sheep, you'll find everywhere when you go there and look. And the bighorn sheep was the symbol of the rain shaman. The whole thing about killing a bighorn sheep and producing rain, metaphorically. And then there's all this stuff here, which seems to be geometric imagery that came because a lot what they did, they take a datura mix when they got there, very powerful mind-altering, psychoactive thing, and they'd commune. And this place was said to be the house of a particular creator god. And as I say, they came from all over, across the Great Basin and so on, into this for untold hundreds of years. We don't know how long. But some of the rock art's very ancient. Some of it's more recent. The last known rain shaman to go there was 1948, actually. It's the last one. Another example is this thing here, a pilgrimage to this very big rock, big as a house, big as a big house. And it's called Ayers Rock. No, not the one in Australia, but in California. And when you get up to it, apart from being very, very big, you find this fabulous rock art on it. And this one actually of a shaman. His eyes are hollows, and these are sort of spirit familiars, spirit helpers. But as you go round this vast rock, much bigger than it looks, you find little areas of paintings and so on, and certain shamans might sit in certain niches of the rock. And again, they came from all along the California Sierras to this place. So it was another pilgrimage point. A still current pilgrimage, because none of these are now current, but one that is current is the pilgrimage of the annual pilgrimage of the Huichol Indians to the Virikutar Plateau, where they collect peyote in baskets and eventually take it back to their home about 300 miles away, and then use it through the year for ritual sacramental purposes. But they also use the peyote while they're up there, and certain rituals are conducted. And it's known as a great hunt. And the peyote becomes a deer. It's complicated stuff. But anyway, it's a fabulous pilgrimage. And I heard a couple of years ago that the poor devils, on their way back, were stopped by the police for carrying drugs. Been doing it for hundreds of years, you know, police. Okay, another type, very mysterious type of sacred geography are lines. Lines drawn in the land, the secrets of straightness. And immediately when we talk about these sort of things, we think of Nazca. And here's some of the Nazca lines in Peru. And these lines all over the place are very straight. Some are very fine and narrow, some are quite broad, and some are sort of trapezoid in shape. So we have an air view here with a great big area like a airfield there, and then thinner, finer lines coming in. And here's a view at ground level of these things. There's another one here. You can see the edges of something here, and then you see that going on up there. And sometimes when you're on the ground, they're not that clear. So here's an example of looking along a line, and you see, because the rocks have moved with winds or whatever over the ages, but at a distance you can see the lines more easily. So we have that sort of thing. And then we say, well, what are these lines? Well, we'll come back to that. Actually, over in Bolivia, on the Altiplano, there are longer lines, more lines, much more than Nazca. So what are they about? Well, okay, Nazca's famous because of the best-selling books of von Daniken, who said that they were landing strips for alien craft. Please. It was a mid-20th century mechanistic projection onto what these things were, because initially they weren't apparent what they were. We didn't know. Now it's pretty clear that they are a spirit geography, a sacred geography, because if you look at quite a lot of the Nazca lines, they've been warped. Deep ruts, apparently from nowhere and to nowhere, that's meaningful to us, but obviously was to them. There was a place called Kawachi, which seems to have been a pilgrimage center related to at least some of the lines. Some of the lines are related to water sources and so on, but clearly they were more than that. They were non-mundane ways through the landscape. Now, I've done quite a bit of work in the Americas on these things, and I've got to tell you, the straight lines are almost everywhere in pre-Columbian. They're finding them in the Amazon now, for example. Have been doing for a few years. And it was the anthropologist, Marlene Dobkin-de-Rios, who suggested, well, she said, look at these are the Nazcan lines, 1,000, 1,500 years old, maybe even a bit older. And if you look at the pottery of that time, you get figures like this, what they call the flying god of Paracas. And he seems to be flying along happily, his hair streaming out, holding something rather mushroom-like. What we do know is that all the people of the Andes took a hell of a lot of psychoactive drugs, no doubt about it, a lot. They find snuff paraphernalia for psychoactive snuffs, drinks, cacti or San Pedro cacti, Chavinta huanta, and it was located with two things. One was spirit flight, and the other was transformation into animals, the sense of transforming, bodily transformation. This is in the Amazon, winged figures carved on the rock, and this is a wood block from medieval Europe, witches flying on a broomstick. Of course, they had their flying ointments, psychoactive herbs mixed into goose fat, and so forth. So it looks more likely that the lines are to do with this idea of otherworld travel. And we had this confirmed with the work on the Kogi Indians of northern Colombia. You may have seen the fabulous BBC documentary, is now available on DVD, The Heart of the World, by Alan Herrera. And it shows these images. And on the edge of one, these are the shamans, if you like, the mamas of the Kogi Indians. And their basic training, traditional training, is that as a young child, if they use divination a lot, mainly using bubbles in bowls of water, and if they identify a child as being mama material, as it were, it just means enlightened ones, they take him away and put him inside a cave where the child would not see daylight again, perhaps for some years. They massaged him to keep his muscles supple, or whatever, and he would be kept in the dark. He would be trained in the way of the mamas, and after a little while, like a few years, he might be taken outside, but only taken outside at night, and he'd wear a big hat, big rimmed hat, so the moon didn't shine, he didn't see it directly, and he didn't see the stars, he just saw the moonlit landscape. And then finally, there's a fabulous bit in the film where they recreate this. Finally, the kid is taken out, the young initiate. When he starts rocking backwards and forwards and singing certain songs, that's always a sign that he's there, he's in the other world, or can see, or is in touch with the other world. And they take him out into the broad daylight, and remember, he hasn't seen any light, and the light blasts into his eyes. And they say from that moment he can see the physical world, but he can see the other world that they call a luna, the dream world, superimposed one on the other. And these people are the descendants of the Tyrannus culture, which flourished. Its fluorescence came when they discovered magic mushrooms. And they've got little gold amulets and things with little mushrooms on. And that became sacramental to them. And there's this mapstone near one of the Tyrannus towns, covered in these lines, as you see. And these lines mark these roads. And the ordinary tribal members are told that it's a religious duty to walk these roads. Think of the tracks on Nazca. Walk the roads, like we might tell rosary beads if you're a Catholic or something like that. That was their religious duty. But these lines mark not only these physical roads, but at certain points the physical roads end, but the mama can see them continuing on in a luna, in the other world. So they're spirit roads, and what the physical roads are physical traces of part of these otherworld routes. So we probably have here a living tradition that tells us quite a bit about what the old lines were ultimately about. The Tyrone Trust is there, tyronestrust.org. They're under constant risk, these people, and so they ask for help and funding and so on to keep them clear as much as possible. And then these sort of simple desert lines in more structured, hierarchical American cultures, American Indian cultures, became sort of ceremonial ways. This is a Mayan causeway or a sack bay. This happens to be in Chichen Itza, but there are many others. They're cut dead straight through the forest, through the jungle. And there's all sorts of legends and traditions about these ways. Here's some more near a place called Sail. There's one, that's the course of one. Another one here leading up to a feature in Sail. The longest one of these causeways, Mayan causeways, starts out from here, this pyramid in Kobar, which is like there, and it runs for 60-odd miles straight to Yashuna, another ritual ceremonial city. Now, I've traced parts of this, and it starts off as a nice causeway because it's been reconstructed, but it quickly descends into what's left, and it's a jumble of stones and rocks that you have to peer through the jungle undergrowth to see. So still do, but it's traceable and has been traced. NASA's done quite a bit of work here using LiDAR photography and infrared photography, so these routes are traced through the jungle. And I've talked to one of the great archaeologists there who has spent 40 years with the Mayans tracing and tracking and mapping these roads. There's the tradition of the Kusam Sun, which is an invisible sack bay, one that runs through the air like a tube. And there's another that runs under the ground that links all the ceremonial ball courts of the Mayan ceremonial cities and so on. So there's like a whole network. And we've come across these virtual or invisible networks elsewhere in the Americas. And I got to move on. Anyway, they all took mushrooms and stuff like that. La Comada in northern Mexico, Zacatecas, a citadel. Nobody really knows too much about it or the people who used it. But around it are these straight road systems. You can see these lines here. And if you go up onto the citadel and look out, you can just see the traces of some of them like that. So this is a mysterious, sacred geography. This is Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. This is one of the great houses on the floor of the canyon, and these roads coming into or going out of Chaco. You see some coming in here. Once upon a time, they were very visible. This photograph was taken in 1901, and you can see they're very big. These people, the Anasazi who built this, had neither wheeled vehicles nor horses. So why do you build a footpath that wide, eh? When it comes to the rim rock of the canyon, there are these remains, heavily eroded ceremonial staircases down into the floor. A lot more I could tell you. Stuff here, this one is 1,600-year-old line in the Gila River Valley in southern Mexico. Sorry, southern Arizona. This is the Vision Quest ring. That's the course of the line. There's a rock at the other end with a notch in it, and you can see a sacred mountain there. And the Pima Indian shaman, the ancestral Pima, would take their datura mix, sit here during midwinter night, and then as the sun rose over there, they'd leave their bodies as they go into this psychoactive out-of-body state, fly along the line to the mountain to meet the spirits. We have them here too, something like this, these curious linear features known as cursuses. There's about 100 of them been found by aerial photography. This one's a mile long, it goes on up there. They seem to link places of the dead. They're Neolithic. This is Bronze Age. stone rose sort of thing you see on Dartmoor, like this one and elsewhere. And then we have the idea of fairy paths, very strong in Celtic countries. Fairy paths in Ireland, paths of the dead in Brittany, for example. And they linked certain sites called raths, which are late prehistoric structures. This is a famous one in County Mayo. Various markers along them, like fairy trees. This happens to be one at Latoun, near Ennis. And then throughout medieval Europe, there was this idea of virtual ways, invisible routes, along which spirits would walk, but you couldn't see them, but they had a definite geography, and you made sure you didn't walk on them at night, because you might encounter something you don't want to encounter. But what they did, they linked physical cemeteries, but there were these paths of the dead. Then there were physical paths. This one, for example, the Old Hell Way on Yorkshire, which were corpse ways or funeral paths for carrying the dead to burial. In Holland, they're called Doodwegen or Spokenwegen, spook roads, because these things became associated with the much older spirit law that existed in Europe. And it's expressed by the old bard himself in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now it is that time of night of the graves all gaping wide. Everyone lets forth his sprite in the churchway paths to glide. So we knew that tradition, the idea of spirits moving down and the spirit traps put on some of these roads and so on. Incidentally, if you want to read the full story of this, I think Roma Harding on her bookstall has My Spirit Roads, where we go into all this thoroughly. I haven't got any copies, but she's managed to find some somewhere. There are other lines that do not relate to the spirits, out-of-body spirits, or spirits of the dead, or spirits of nature, and we don't know what they are. This is Tye Creek. You pass that Buffalo Rock on the way to this. Scraped, glacially scraped bedrock, and these curious, probably about 1,500-year-old boulder patterns, or petriforms as they're known, extraordinary things. The Indians call them Manitowabi, where God or the Great Spirit sits. And of course, it's where Manitoba gets its name from. So these are very curious features. Another odd feature, again, near that pilgrimage route up the Colorado River Valley, full of lines. And these lines were used for ritual running. The Native American braves did run and run and run, literally till they dropped. Sometimes they died, and it was to get into other states of consciousness. Wonderful record of some of the visions some of the runners had. Then if you go to outer places like Death Valley and to some of the remote locations, and you know where to look, there are very ancient pathways. This one created simply by the removal of the volcanic rock litter. Others that are just dead odd things that are built that are probably magical, result from magical activity by the Pima Indian, ancestral Indians, about 2,000 years ago. We have some ethnology on that. Giants in the earth, another type of highly related, in many cases highly related sacred geography. The famous Serpent Mound, for example, in Ohio. It's about 4 or 5 feet tall. There's no burials or anything in it, just a serpent mound. Very interesting. The Hopewell Indians produced loads of pure, beautiful geometric earthworks. Hexagons, circles, all sorts of geometric shapes, and long straight road. There's one that cuts almost all the way across Ohio, for example. We know the Hopewell people actually were a confederation of tribes, but they all subscribed to a shamanism that centered on the use of magical mushrooms, and these antlerhead and this wooden model of a mushroom was found in a shaman's grave. Death Valley, strange imagery laid out in petriforms, very much like Manitoba. Then in northern upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Iowa, and so on, there are these effigy mounds, some of which look like crosses between human beings and birds. Again, probably to do with the idea of spirit flight. This is a 1912 photograph of one of the great images in Wisconsin. It's been outlined with flour, so you can see it. Damn difficult to photograph at ground level. From the air in Iowa, you've got all these images, mainly abstract, but some things like this bear, which is about 300 feet long, and which will give you a scale, but lots of circles and other shapes and so on. These birds, this bird here outlined in the snow is this one here, and a lot of stuff, you know. And that human Indian pilgrimage trail that I mentioned is at periodic points along it are giant geoglyphs, big markings of animal or human figures. These posts are 5 feet high to give you some sort of a scale, and there's lots of them. Well, I say lots, but there's quite a few. Dating seems to go back to about 3,000 years ago. I'm going to skip a lot of stuff now. Mapping the monuments, you're all familiar with that anyway. Stone circles put at exact points that within 100 yards, if you move this stone circle on Bodmin Moor this way a bit, you wouldn't see Brown Willie there, the distant natural sites. This is Gorse Vow Stone Circle in Preseli. That is the Carnmenin outcrop there, and again you see it's on the skyline. Actually, if you go to the Hurlers on Bodmin Moor, on the skyline there is the Cheese Ring, the natural tor. And we know about archaeoastronomy, so I won't go into that. Then the soundscapes. Well, we did sound this morning, but I'd mention a couple of interesting other aspects of acoustics. These are the Arapesh people in Papua New Guinea, and these are members of the men's secret society, the Tambaran. And Donald Tuzin, who lived with them for a while, anthropologist, noted these curious instruments that they have. Some of them are like 15 feet long, often put in sort of tubes that fit into a slit drum at the end, various other things. And at certain times, they all gather together, bring out the secret instruments, and start playing them, blowing in them, whatever they do. And he said this unearthly sound comes up out of the forest, and they're supposed to be the voices of the forest spirits. But he said, there's some other element going on here. He said, it really gets through to you. And what he found out was they started doing this activity when there were thunderstorms about 12 miles away. And he said, you couldn't hear the thunder, but he was pretty sure the infrasound from the thunder was rolling through their landscape. And these things sort of rode the infrasonic waves through the landscape. And he said it gave the most powerful and eerie experience you could imagine. The Buddhists, especially Shingon Buddhism, were very into landscapes that spoke with the cosmic language of the Buddha. This is how Grappard put it. Waves, pebbles, winds and birds, the elementary and unconscious performers of the cosmic speech of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. This happens to be Mount Nantai and Lake Chizenji, and the temple at Chizenji was noted by Kukai, founder of Shingon Buddhism. He said, all this landscape speaks with the voice of the Buddha if you listen to the natural sounds. And that was a similar thing with the Kunisaki Peninsula in Japan, and that was in Japan, of course. And the Kunisaki Peninsula is very interesting because it's got all these radial valleys coming out, as you see there. This is the sea. Not a very clear picture. And as you wander around, you'll see rock carvings and so on. And it was said that it's basically the lotus scroll in landscape form. There are so many valleys as there are verses in the lotus scroll and whatever. And just walking and listening to the babbling brooks or the bird song or whatever is the equivalent of reading the lotus scroll. So this idea of, remember the Tuvan throat singers had a similar idea. And then in the book that's coming out, the Sacred Geography book, I also go into enchanted gardens, and I mentioned a little of that with the acoustics. This is a Zen garden, which is a sort of miniature landscape, but some Zen gardens also use the greater landscape. And we think there's probably an acoustic dimension there as well. But this will be the book. It's supposed to be out next month, but, you know, publishers' like it's now been pushed back till October. And if you're really interested in this stuff, lots and lots of pictures and proper reference stuff, what I've just babbled at you to keep within the thing. So, what does it teach? Well, it's no good. We don't want to create these landscapes now, but they do teach us something. This idea I mentioned at the beginning of investing the land with mythic meaning. And in a way we're doing it now, like the Belinus line and the St. Michael line and that thing. They're projections onto the land, I have to tell you. But they is a way of sort of seeking meaning in our modern world. I would like us to seek something a bit richer and more deeply rooted myself. But anyway, it's the same idea of investing the land, the waters, the sky with meaning. And if we could do that, see, as we know, our culture, the mainstream culture, only sees land and these things as utilities, things we can draw oil from, or have got rocks you can use and grind down and make roads with and so on. And so we have a utilitarian thing with the landscape, but Aboriginal peoples, ancient peoples, also invested the land with these spiritual aspects. And I guess if we could do that as a whole culture today, if the whole Western culture could do it, then we'd look after that landscape a little better. And our sacred geography is now global, and we have to think of it in that rounded way, whereas other people only had relatively small territories to invest with their mythology and spirituality. But we need to do that now. We do know this idea of treating the earth as a sacred thing come through the Gaia hypothesis and so on, and the people are becoming aware of that. But it's still a long, long way from reaching the ears of the corporate world and the political world. So the sooner we can get them to invest meaning in the land, in the globe, the safer we'll all be. Okay, thank you. Peak to the Wintu Indians who live in the territory, and their tradition is that when you die, your soul travels to the peak of Mount Shasta and then off to heaven. And there's a secret geography around here. There are little rocks set up on perching on the edges of cliffs and so on. They are markers, and they're markers for the soul of dead people, so they can find them and find their way. Similar ideas in Oceania. Kiribati has places where the soul goes in a straight line to the place of dread, and that's a marked route through the landscape. Other examples of sacred peaks, Mount Siluritis, the old Mount Ida in Crete, the temple palace of Phaistos, the lines to it, and there's a whole thing about cleft or saddle peaks in Crete, or in Greece generally. And these are significant features. You see there's a sort of black hole there. That's the sacred cave of Comares. So you've got a double significance here. If you go on to mainland Greece, those Greeks picked up stuff from the Minoans who occupied Crete, and they built stuff underneath cleft peaks. So, for example, this is the temple of Eleusis, and it's overlooked by Mount Karata, which is a very significant, powerful cleft peak. And Eleusis, of course, was the mystery temple of ancient Greece, where they probably drank ergotized beer, natural LSD, and went through great rituals, and Plato and Pythagoras, all of them went through this, and it was said that those who went through this initiation never feared death afterwards. Back on much older, Geoffrey Ash said it's much older, it says that King Arthur will ride out of Cadbury Castle and lead the wild host. And you know the legend of the wild host. It's all over Europe in medieval and early medieval and even earlier times. The idea of a furious host of spirits led by some charismatic god, a hero figure, a goddess, whatever. And they would whoosh through the landscape, picking up anybody that was very ill or on their deathbeds or whatever, and take the souls with them. And indeed, this was greatly feared in medieval times, and there are actual instructions of how not to be taken by the wild host. And in case you need to know, and ever in that position, you lie on your back and you cross your arms like that, like some Egyptian pharaoh. And they might pass over with a bit of luck. Close your eyes, by the way. So it shoots over you. And what they did here, between Cadbury Castle, they went to the Tor to deliver the souls they picked up to the mouth of Annan. So they delivered to the underworld. And King Arthur was at the head. So it's at least half a millennium old, that legend, and maybe much older. Now, what's interesting, archaeological digs on Cadbury Castle have revealed, the remains of what might have been the old Camelot, a great fortified structure and citadel. But in the last few years, they excavated a burial site of early Bronze Age, much older, sort of 2000 BC, 1800 BC. And it was the burial of a large male, had his bones there, and he was buried in a ritual boat. And it was on the side of Cadbury Castle that faces the Tor, which is perfectly visible on the skyline. So it's a landmark. And the prow of this boat, the pointy end, pointed to the Tor. So it looked like, and if you remember the legends, the romances, the Arthurian romances, that the dying Arthur is put in a fairy bark and taken to the land of immortal souls. And one can only wonder if that early Bronze Age burial of this very tall fellow was really where that element of the Arthurian romances began. Long, long ago, thousands of years ago. It's known that there's Iron Age mythology encoded in the Arthurian romance, but my guess is it goes back further. But anyway, so the wild host runs down there. You've got this curious archaeological linkage pointing to the Tor. And in fragments along the way of the wild host, there are actual old trackways, sections of trackways, that mark out exactly the same course. So we get a sense that there's a multi-layered mythological patina over this landscape that relates to this particular landmark. And then we know what the Christians did. And there they are. So it's natural places, venerated places, attracted the attention of early peoples, and through the ages, mythological filters built over them. Another type of natural sacred place, of course, were sacred peaks. This is just an excuse to show this painting by Nicholas Rurick. Beautiful, it always fascinates me. What do we have? Sacred peaks. Oh, Mount Shasta, California, Northern California. It's a sacred... It's pretty crammed. I'm going to go through at a rate of knots, so please forgive it. Sacred geography. We'll look at some different types of sacred geography. And what is sacred geography? Good question. What sacred geography is, it's the meeting of physical landscape, topography, and the human mind and spirit and soul, whatever you want. Geographies of the soul, if you like. And it's a meeting of those two elements. And as I shall say at the end, with a dramatic picture, that what ancient peoples did, they invested their landscape with meaning. And generally as a culture, we don't do that now. And I'll come back to that. Magical mindscapes, sacred geography, however you want to describe it. Most sacred geographies, plural, are either visual or auditory or a bit of both, but they can use other sensory things, and I'll just mention this in passing. For example, on this Sawieki in one of the Fijian islands, there's a sacred place, it's a beach, and the sand smells like vanilla. And because of that scent, natural scent there, it became imbued with meaning, with spiritual significance. So there can be many things that will trigger a sacred geography. But I thought we'd look at about 7 or 8 different types of sacred geography. The first being what I call the topography of myth, venerated natural places, because the first sacred geography, if you like, was the unadulterated land itself. And people living in different landscapes would gravitate towards particular features in the landscape, which they would imbue with the sacred, where they would go and get a sense of the numinous. And these were the first sacred places. Levi Brule said of the Australian or Australasian Aborigine, "The land is a living book in which the myths are inscribed. A legend is captured in the very outlines of the landscape." And as I say, I was saying that about Australasian Aboriginal peoples, but he could have said it about any Aboriginal peoples anywhere in the world. Their myths, they lived amongst their mythic imagery. Okay, what sort of sites would acquire this numinous power, or have a numinous power that attracted people? Well, we'll start right where we are. Always a good idea. Landmarks, various types of landmarks, things that stuck out in the landscape, would naturally attract the attention of people living in those landscapes. And we know here at Glastonbury, I mean, the Tor is quite a distinctive landmark, and it becomes the focus for myth and legends. And we all know that sort of soft luminosity that occurs here. And it has a magical, the Isle of Avalon and all the rest of it. I'll tell you an interesting legend that's associated. I mean, it was supposedly the last place for the king of the fairies. It was the entrance to Annwn, the Celtic underworld or otherworld. But it's an interesting feature you may or may not know about, but you know Cadbury Castle is about 12 miles away, believed to be the site of the actual historical Camelot. But on there's a legend, it certainly goes back to the 15th century, and possibly much